I think we'll get going now. So, welcome to today's webinar, The Energy Transition in 2021. My name is John Slow. I'm a director here at Delta, and I'm joined by my colleagues Jennifer Aaron, Arthur Johannek, and Andy Bradley. The webinar will be about 40 minutes today. We've got 3 polls for you. We will be recording the webinar, and the recording will be available afterwards. We'll send you a link to that. And in terms of rules, there are no rules. So you'll get the slides from the recording. You can use the GoToWebinar panel to ask questions to us at any time and participate in our polls. So let's get going. We're going to talk about 4 things today. Now we developed some scenarios back in April 2020 about what COVID would mean for the energy transition. We'll start by looking at them and then look at some numbers and markets, some companies, and look forward to what's next.
John,
before we go on to...
We can't see your screen, John, actually. You haven't moved forward on the slide.
Oh. How's that? Has that moved forward now?
Yes, it has. Yeah.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that, everyone. Okay, we'll start with the first poll. So we'll reveal our predictions and whether they've come, or our scenarios, and whether they've come true or not in a minute. But we'll start by asking you a question. What do you think the impact of COVID has been on the energy transition? Now, you can place your votes. No one can see your votes, so it's confidential. And take your best guess at what you think share what you think your view is. I'll give you maybe 10 more seconds to vote. I can see more than half the people have voted. So I encourage you to give your best view as to what you think the impact's been. 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1, and that's 3/4 of you voted. I'll close the poll now and share the result. Okay, and you can see, so most people think it's been positive, 55% slightly positive, a few scattered all over the different answers, but a general consensus is that it's been positive on the energy transition. Okay, let's go to see what we said. Andy, over to you for the next slide.
Okay, thank you, John. Okay, thank you, John. So I had a look back at what we said last April when we wrote a couple of viewpoints and white papers around the impact of the pandemic. And on the left here, you just see some of the things that we talked about then. Talked about tension between global harmony and national disunity, the degree to which the world was going to work together versus nationalism taking precedence. We talked about perhaps an opportunity of low energy prices and the opportunity to kind of remove some of the massive fossil subsidies that are still in place around the world. We talked about COVID being an opportunity for the acceleration of the energy transition, and we also talked about how there could be a shift towards local supply chains to improve resilience. So this was in the very first month of the pandemic when we talked about those issues. And John, if you could just go forward to the next slide. I mean, taking each of those in turn, I think it's become evident that in the very big picture, the degree of global harmony versus national disunity is really a mixed picture. I mean, in some respects, it's improved towards or shifted towards global harmony just with Biden coming into the White House. But all of the discussions, particularly in Europe, that we've had over the last year or so around the vaccines just shows the reality of the world really, and the important role that nationalism has to play. So the world will remain on twin tracks is our current view. Sometimes the world will come together, but many times it won't. And as far as our specific focus is concerned around the energy transition, COP26, I guess, is the next big stepping stone for indication about how well the world will work together
I'd say that's
address challenges.
I'd say that's quite encouraging, actually, Andy. The move to global unity can give us a sense of optimism for COP26.
Mhm.
So compared to how it could have played out, and much more nationalistic, much less global unity, I'd probably take that as a positive, I think.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think in the broader spectrum, I think the twin tracks are valid, but in our space, I think I would say it's shifted towards global harmony, mainly because just Trump has left the White House, if nothing else. Um, what about the next one of taking advantage of low energy prices to kind of rebalance the way that the subsidies work for fossil? And there's been no evidence of that. I think quite clearly governments had their hands full dealing with many other issues, obviously, and it just hasn't been a priority and something that governments have been able to focus on. So nothing has happened in that regard. But on the next one, it's interesting to see the poll result there that few people had voted for slightly negative, and I'd be interested to understand what perspective those people were coming from. But certainly from our perspective at Delta E, I mean, we see the opportunity for accelerating the energy transition has been grasped by many companies, and as we go through the slides in the next half an hour or so, I think we'll be presenting evidence to that actually some of these markets have moved forward really quite rapidly and probably jumped ahead 2 to 3 years faster than they otherwise would have done because of the pandemic. So our view is actually the energy transition has accelerated, and the headline there, UVW. When I look back at what was written and what we wrote a year or so back, it was a bit of an alphabet soup, to be honest. Is the recovery going to be a U-shaped? Going to take some time? Is it going to be V-shaped? Is it going to bounce back really quickly? Is it going to be W? It's going to be ups and downs. There's also L's and K's. L, it won't recover. K's, it will be a mixed recovery. And I've said actually for the energy transition, it's a J. I think it's recovered and it's actually above where it would have been if it hadn't been for the pandemic in many respects.
I think so. The green tinge to the recovery and this economic stimulus, I think, is really important, Andy.
Great, yeah.
I also think the energy systems learned to cope with, as demand fell in the lockdowns, and we still had the same renewable generation. The energy system learned to cope with balancing high generation and low demand in a way that it hadn't had to. So it brought those challenges forward, and the energy systems overcome those challenges.
Yeah, no, I agree. And on the last bullet there, I think that's reflected in perhaps one area. I mean, I personally thought there would be quite a shift towards local supply chains to improve resilience, but actually the energy system has proved really resilient through this period, actually, and therefore perhaps the impact of the pandemic has been quite limited. I mean, there are the existing sort of pre-COVID trends are still playing out, so there is I think a gradual shift towards decentralization and local solutions generally, I think, in the energy world, and that's continuing. But I don't think the pandemic's really caused a step change in those trends so far, and I think that's partly because the system has proved so resilient over the last 18 months or so.
Thanks, Andy. So these were the dimensions that we looked at the recovery. Let's look to the next section now and what's actually happened in the market. So, Jennifer, you're going to take us through a few numbers and outlooks for different parts of the new energy market.
Yeah, thanks, John. I mean, I think you said to me, pull out the numbers that stick out most, and it was a really challenging task, actually, because through COVID-19, we've certainly not been any quieter at Delta, and there's been a ton of interesting analysis. So picking a few snapshots were challenging. I do like a map, though, and this one stood out in particular because it just shows the trend that we've seen from the poll, that actually new energy is continuing to grow. So even in a COVID year, we've seen significant growth across the market and at a faster pace than the previous year, which is really interesting and exciting. It also highlights the trends that we've already talked about around eMobility being really important and critical in a lot of markets. It's taking off in a huge way, but also new heating is really important across a number of different markets, which is really encouraging because perhaps we would have maybe think of new heating as being one of the slower trends, but it is gathering pace quite rapidly. And then in terms of the future, a trend that's going to continue, I think. So we'll see Germany continue to lead the way, perhaps, out of these markets that we've got here in terms of this analysis. But we expect, France and the UK to gather pace and, keep up with the Netherlands in terms of second and third place. So it's going to be a really interesting time. Oh, I think we might have lost John.
All right, okay.
Are you back, John? Having a few technical problems. Okay, I'm just going to carry on then. In the face of technical problems. We can't hear you, John.
In true lockdown. Oh.
We can hear you now, John. Yeah, just crack on, Jennifer.
I'll just crack on. I mean, in terms of trends, eMobility we've talked about a lot, we will talk about a lot. It's just kind of impossible to ignore the fact that the EV market is rapidly moving forward. One thing that we noticed this year is the trend for residential chargers has grown particularly rapidly. So there's been a kind of, I think, 150+% increase in residential charger sales this year, which I think indicates that infrastructure is starting to catch up with the EV market. And that's becoming less of a challenge. So perhaps customers aren't so put off now by the infrastructure concerns of EV because it's becoming more a standard across the market. The other thing on this chart that you have to mention that stood out to me is that crossover point. It's not that far away. By 2026, we predict that EV sales will outpace internal combustion engine car sales. And then by 2030, we're seeing them take 90% of the market share, which is a massive, massive change.
Sorry about those technical difficulties. True working from home, COVID internet challenges. Jennifer, I don't know if you mentioned it, but one of the things that strikes me when we see these inflection points in the market, I don't know if you mentioned this, but these inflection points usually happen more quickly than people think. And when they happen more sharply than people think. And I think the EV market is a really good illustration of that. And it's probably the first of the markets at the customer end of the value chain, maybe PV in Germany or Australia, where we're really seeing that rapid inflection point. And I think we'll see it in other markets over time as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that, so again, like a map, I particularly like this map. And actually this links back to something Andy said right at the start around local supply chains. So what we're seeing potentially in the next few years in Europe is a real trend towards starting to supply product within Europe. And our recent Gigafactories analysis by the energy storage team just highlights how quickly that transformation can happen and how critical that's going to be for meeting the kind of climate goals in Europe to bring that supply chain into Europe so we're less reliant on imports. This is also really, oh, sorry, John.
You finished, Jennifer. Okay, sorry, Karen.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's really important as well for highlighting that, this is linked very much to the EV story, but there could be other winners in the market from that. So perhaps EVs are pushing the drive to do this within Europe, but, stationary storage could be a real winner here in terms of its increased capacity, which in turn will facilitate opportunities for greater flexibility.
And I think we might actually see overbuild in the battery manufacturing market in Europe. If we look at the numbers for stationary storage, in 2020, it was around 2 gigawatt hours a year went into the stationary storage market. 2021, our forecast is a bit over 3 gigawatt hours. And the capacity shown on this map dwarfs those numbers. And while a lot of that will go to EV, even when we do the maths on our EV projections, you've got more capacity being built than there'll be need for in the short term. So that could have a downward effect on prices and therefore open up opportunities for stationary storage.
And I think that downward price curve, I guess, would coincide probably with the implementation of the clean energy package. So we've seen that being quite patchy and going quite slowly in some markets. But as that, comes together, to coincide with this price decrease, you could see a real transformation in the market.
Okay, so we talked about EVs and batteries, Jennifer. Heat, no?
Have to talk about heat. I'm a big fan of heat. And actually, we've done some work recently called the eHeat map, which has gone much wider than our previous heat research, looking across all sorts of different markets in Europe. And the numbers on the side are today numbers, and it just highlights, I think, the size of the potential opportunity. We're already seeing hydronic heat pumps going into oil retrofit and new build, becoming the dominant technology in some cases. Air-to-air is becoming a really important near-term electric HVAC technology. And then the electric hot water heater market is almost an untapped potential market for replacements with heat pumps, and it's huge and established. And I think the kind of map highlights the scale of the opportunity, that there's a really big and big prizes to go after across Europe. Heat's something that everyone needs. It's important. And actually there's plenty of opportunities out there. And we see this opportunity coming sooner than 2030. You know, we see by 2025 that all of these listed opportunities here could kind of be dominated by heat pump technologies.
So we're not at the inflection. We're definitely not at the inflection point, Jennifer, in the same way we are with EVs. I guess that market is still reliant on a lot of policy and regulatory instruments coming into play that aren't there yet. But we can see it starting with new build, I guess, and as you said, oil, off-gas grid markets, and in some countries, maybe Netherlands, on gas as well.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, that's obviously a harder market to crack into. I think one of the most interesting opportunities here is that kind of existing market, replacement market for electric heating appliances. And that's something that we've not looked at in as much detail as we have now. And it's a big prize to go after. So even if you don't go after the gas, initially, there's potential huge growth from those electric opportunities.
So not a map on this slide, Jennifer.
No, but we couldn't talk about trends without talking about hydrogen. Everyone's talking about hydrogen, so we had to include a slide on it. And I think the key questions continue to be, how quickly will it, become a reality, and where will it be used? And I think the analysis we've got here from the Global Hydrogen Intelligence Service just highlights that, it is going to be rapid in terms of how quickly it can scale up. And in terms of where it's going to be used, we're seeing that industry is the kind of main demand sector in the near term from green hydrogen.
So lots of growth in this, Jennifer, but I guess from a very small base. So if we put these numbers in terms of gigawatts of electrolyzer capacity, that number for 2025, based on planned projects, is only a few gigawatts, about 3 gigawatts.
Mm-hmm.
So very rapid growth from the tens of megawatts where we are today. Lots of opportunity, but in some ways a very small part of the energy system still in 2025.
Yeah, and if it is at that 3 gigawatt level, that's kind of lower than the ambition that really Europe's kind of setting itself as well. So it'll be interesting to see if it goes more quickly than we even expect.
Yeah. Okay, so that was.
There's a couple of questions there. There's a couple of questions there, John, just on the couple of the charts you showed. Jennifer, one referring to the heat map, potential for France and Switzerland being high. Why are they in the high category? Presumably it's to do with the degree of electrification, cheap electricity prices.
Yeah, I think that's it, Andy. So I think there's a lot of existing electric heating. So it's more like replacement market rather than putting heat pumps into properties that are currently on, different technologies. So yeah, I think it's linked into that, and then low electricity prices, and then we've also looked at regulation. But my heat colleagues will be able to respond on that point better than I can.
I mean, Arthur, you're located in France. Have you seen much of a step change at all in the heat market, or the discussion in France regarding electrification, the role of heat pumps?
Yeah, I mean, Obviously, France is already the biggest electrified heating market in the biggest European countries. But right now, basically, in practically all new built houses, you'll have to install a hydronic heat pump. And the government is putting a lot of money behind replacing oil boilers with heat pumps, gas boilers with heat pumps, especially for lower income households. So, and the heat pump market has already been growing really fast in the last 2 years. So it's probably the most ready industry across Europe, and we expect to see a huge growth in terms of heat pumps numbers in the next 2 or 3 years, and I guess as well in the next decade. So we are very optimistic about the French market.
Switzerland is an interesting market. It's a huge success story there. In heat pumps have basically taken over from oil heating in Switzerland, and that was quite a time ago they did that. Arthur, there's still a chunk of oil heating in France there today, so that's a growth opportunity.
And the government even pushed back the law that says you're forbidden to replace an oil boiler with an oil boiler by 6 months, which is a bit of a shame in terms of ambition to accelerate the transition. But oil boilers will be banned quite soon. So the only technology that can really replace this is heat pumps or biomass, but heat pumps are likely to be the winners in this case.
Okay. Let's have a look now at companies. So oil majors versus clean energy majors. This is a nice provocative title. Who's going to take us through
it's something we hear more about actually in the news and across the markets. But I mean, the oil majors we've seen a few things in the news recently. The first thing is Total rebranding to Total Energies, and there have been quite a lot of noise about this. Even the cycling team on the Tour de France has changed jersey because of this. But basically, I think Total wants to, with this rebranding, they want to make a shift from a focus on oil and gas to becoming a major player in the energy transition, and they say actively tackling climate change. Shell has been ordered by Dutch court to cut CO2 emissions by, I think, 45% by 2030. And it stated that Shell is responsible for all direct and indirect carbon emissions. So it's kind of the first in a long series, I guess, of potential oil majors to be forced to cut emissions. And the 3 European oil majors, so Shell, BP, Total, have announced they want to reach net zero by 2050. So that's an interesting trend to see. But what's particularly interesting on the electric utility side is that the likes of Iberdrola, Enel, Ørsted, maybe a few others, are now being called the clean energy majors, the renewable energy majors, and that is being seen on the market capitalization market. As you can see, this extract from I think the Wall Street Journal, where you can see the evolution of the market cap from oil majors and clean energy majors over time, and you can see that the trend is moving really rapidly towards the clean energy majors being worth more than the oil majors, which I don't think could have been possible even 5 years ago. So the speed at which this is changing is really fascinating, I think.
I think the interesting thing on that graph, Arthur, or that chart from the Wall Street Journal, 2010 to 2015, Enel and Iberdrola lost a bit of value or only gained a tiny bit, but so there was some value destruction certainly amongst European utilities in that period. But between 2015 to 2020, huge growth in their market capitalization.
I think it's a really interesting topic actually. I mean, I think the European oils are making some really interesting moves actually. Shell and Total in particular. I mean, Total have probably, of all the oil companies, have sort of moved earliest, made some interesting acquisitions. Shell have done some really interesting things more recently, and I think they're proving they're serious about this actually. But the reality is they're probably starting a decade late actually. So they're likely to feel the pain quite sharply, I think, in the next few years. Another thing that strikes me is particularly the big oils, the major oils are after global scale opportunities, which obviously makes real obvious sense for those companies to think like that. But the reality is, in many of the topics that we're focusing on talking about in this webinar, those global scale opportunities need to be identified, developed, and built over the next decade or so. That's the end point, really. That's not where to start. So I think sometimes I wonder whether they're asking the right question, actually. The question should be about how do we get there? What's the roadmap? What's the steps that we need to take to build that global scale business, rather than trying to focus on that end point today. And I think that's the major oils for me need to kind of change their mindset a bit. And if you think of nothing else, I mean, a lot of the transition is about electrification. Electricity is really a local or regional market at best, and actually, understanding that regional, national, local market dynamics and coming up with business models that are transferable perhaps between different localities, but adaptable to the infrastructure, starting point, climate, building stock, all these types of things is I think the challenge. So for me, I think they're moving in the right direction, and I think they are absolutely serious about it, but I kind of do question whether they have the right mindset on, perhaps need to reset the way that they're thinking about business models. But I think,
yeah, and
that's what you're saying.
And what particularly strikes me is when you listen to the CEOs of the oil majors right now, and what they talk about the energy transition a lot, but when you see what's actually happening and the number of projects of new drilling happening and new announcements like this, it's just like it makes you wonder whether it's just greenwashing or whether this is really the real focus. I think we conducted a study 2 years ago saying that less than 1% of their investments was actually on clean energy. So it tells you a lot on the journey they're on in the early stages of that.
But I think we have to, I mean, the reality is we need the oil. I mean, in Europe, we are hugely dependent upon imports of oil from parts of the world which, are unstable and perhaps not, politically, friendly. So, there's a really big challenge for the energy transition around how we secure our energy supplies over the next decade or so, as we go through the transition. The quicker we go through the transition, in a way, the quicker we find the answer to that. But until we do get through the transition, actually we need to continue to have availability of fuels that we need to heat our homes and drive our cars. So I think it's a big challenge, and I think the oil companies are in a really difficult position. We need their financial, technical, professional capability, I think, applied to the energy transition at full blast to accelerate it. There's no doubt about that in my mind. But how do we allow them to continue to invest in their upstream business while showing the commitment they need to show to the energy transition businesses? I think, and that's a huge question. I think, unfortunately, they're starting 10 years late, as I said. So.
They're starting late, but I think in this right-hand part of this this slide, the distributed energy market, as it says in grey, this is a new battleground, and I don't think that battleground is still quite wide open in many ways. They're local markets, as has been said. There's no one obviously ahead of the game in terms of developing those local markets, those customer propositions, those scalable business models. So I think the next few years we'll see a huge amount of more growth, as Jennifer illustrated earlier, in these markets. And there's a real battle between the various types of companies listed in this on that right-hand side of the chart to win in those markets. A lot of partnerships in the short term, because no one has all of the strengths, no one can deliver the whole value chain. But this is where the huge growth will be in the next decade, and these are the big opportunities.
Yeah, but the only issue is to be careful, especially for the existing large OEMs like the auto industry or the HVAC, to not be disrupted by the likes of Tesla and others, because we have seen this. I think Tesla is now the most valuable car company in the world, and there are rumors that they could even move into the heat pump market. So while the transition seems to be like a great opportunity for all of them, there are other players who have huge ambitions and perhaps different skill set to make that happen. And this will quickly change the market.
Yeah, even with heat pumps, there's some very, very good products from China now coming into Europe.
Yeah.
So there'll be a lot of competition in these markets. A lot of innovation, but it makes it exciting.
Yeah, and John, there are also like the new thing that we are seeing as well is that where in the past the distribution network companies, the DSOs, were just not really playing a role in this, but increasingly now with electrification, they have to change the way they operate. They have to change technology. They have to innovate. They have to adapt to the transition, and that's something that's particularly interesting these days.
Yeah, the utility scale renewables happens at the transmission level mainly, but all of the big developments over this decade will happen at the distribution at the low voltage level. They'll happen at customers' premises or close to customers' premises. So distribution networks will really come into the spotlight. There's big opportunities for them, but big challenges to make sure they can facilitate all of this. Okay. Very quickly on this slide, keeping on time. Who wants to give a take out from this slide?
Yeah, I mean, John, I think I added this one in. It's just summarizing or bringing in some of the research from our business model service. From sort of last summer, we talked to a lot of companies, particularly startup companies, about how they were progressing through the transition. And overwhelmingly, we after the initial period of conserving cash and being, staying alive, really, we've just heard almost universally positive news about opportunity and stronger funding possibilities than was previously the case. So certainly in the kind of startup innovation space, we think that the impact of the downturn, if you like, wasn't very long, and actually the recovery came through within 6 months or so. So we're well into that recovery period now, which is why I come back to the J that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. I mean, when you look at the bigger companies, the chart on the right there just sort of compares the EBITDA, and actually for kind of some of the major utilities there in Europe, you can see that actually their EBITDA reported for last year was pretty consistent with previous year or previous years actually. So yes, there have been impacts, but actually those companies have managed it pretty well. The two on the right, BP and Shell, very different picture, much more exposed to the oil price, which obviously came through in the financials for their last year. This year it might be a completely different picture if the oil price stays at $75, of course, but it just shows that actually in the kind of the energy utility space or the energy supplier space, those companies actually weathered the storm on the whole very well. And as I've mentioned on our business model research, looking at the more sort of startup innovation area, I think we would have a very positive story based on the research we've been doing.
Yeah, no shortage of innovators. A lot seem to be able to raise capital, raise funding.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a wall of money out there looking to find a way to get exposure to the energy transition, private capital. And the challenge is, how they can get exposure, what kinds of assets, innovations, infrastructure should they be betting on for the next decade.
And I think at the moment, more money than opportunities. So
absolutely, yeah.
Okay, looking forward to what's next, briefly. So these are probably the 6 biggest questions we're hearing from the market, the 6 different areas. It's not necessarily to say they are these 6 areas, but they're the 6 areas we're hearing most questions about. I won't go through them all individually, but we'll run our next poll now. And if I open it up, so the question we'd like to ask you is, from these 6, which 2 do you think are most important for the energy transition? So you can pick 2 answers here. If you look at these 6, and if you look at the 5, the software only allows me to have 5 answers. So I've taken EVs out because I think they're obvious. They're going like gangbusters. We've seen they're past the inflection point. But for the other 5, which 2 would you pick as the most important for the energy transition in the next years? So that's half of you voted now. Give you a few more seconds to place your votes. That's over 2/3. That's 3/4. 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1, and I'll close the poll and share the results. So quite a mixture, which suggests to me they're all really important for the energy transition because we've got a really good spread across them. Flexibility probably being the biggest one, and these overlap as well because with heat we need fantastic propositions. So they're not quite either or questions, but interesting to see your responses. And I'll hide that now.
Actually, John, I think if you ask the same question in 2 years' time, hydrogen might be the #1 topic in this list, but that's a personal opinion.
We'll see. There's some very polarized views on the role of hydrogen and the energy transition out there. I think there's a lot to still unfold in the next years. We're very excited at Delta, coming back to, I guess, what Andy said at the beginning and COP26. So we're a bit on tenterhooks about COP26. What will happen? What level of agreement and consensus will there be? How will pledges actually turn into plans? So these are all the different ways in which we're working with the energy sector to help get to net zero as quick as we can. Everyone on the call can do their bit, we can do our bit, but to a degree, we're reliant on our political leaders to come to a really strong agreement in Glasgow later this year. Anyone, Andy, Arthur, Jennifer, any comments on the responses of the poll, on final thoughts before we move on to the last poll?
I think from my side, it's just interesting to see how equal they all were. You know, there wasn't a huge differentiation there. And flexibility,
Yeah.
I think I would agree, is probably critical because it's almost the thing that's going to weave a lot of these technologies together. So it's going to link with what the network companies are doing. It's going to have to be, it's going to be part of the critical of the value piece for heat. It could form part of the basis for some really exciting heat propositions beyond 2025 once those values are available. So for me, that almost kind of is a critical jigsaw puzzle piece in terms of getting this right, is enabling that flexibility to enable all these different technologies in the decentralized energy space to link up together and create new value streams so that you can really engage customers.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's.
Yeah, there's flexibility, and the propositions, I guess, are in a way the glue that knits everything together.
Yeah, and to me, we haven't put that in the list of answers, but energy management, and especially in the home, is becoming a question that I receive from practically all the companies I speak to, because it links between the EV charging, potentially the heat pumps, the PV, the battery, etc. And there is an increasing number of companies looking at how locally to better manage and optimize energy consumption in the home. And with the increased number of solar PV on the roof, the increased number of EV charging, and the release of dynamic electricity tariffs, that is becoming absolutely critical. And potentially customers will have a need for someone to better manage their their energy in the home. So this is potentially going to be a critical topic in the next 2 to 5 years.
And I think it's a sign of the energy system being optimized much more bottom up rather than top down. So optimized in the home, at the office building level, university campus level, community level, local distribution network area level. So much more bottom up optimization that we'll see in the next years.
Yeah.
So the last slide. Some of you will listen to our podcast. We publish an episode a week when we're running our series with guests from across the energy sector, talking about their jobs and different aspects of the energy transition. So if you're into podcasts, encourage you to listen to that. And we're not advertising an old summit here. We would like to run a new summit, but we have a question to ask you. Will you be attending international events over the course of the autumn or winter? The feedback we get from our summits is fantastic. We have 80, 100, low hundreds of people there. It's a great opportunity to talk with peers and discuss issues together. So yeah, to help us with our planning, very interested in what your personal plans might be for traveling. I won't publish the answers to this one. I just say we're getting a mix of results in at the moment. So clearly it's a very personal issue.
John, while people are looking at that, there's a interesting question from Gerard about DSOs actually. And how does the changing role of DSOs fit with the current market model in Europe? Thought you might, it's a big question, but thought you might like to comment on it.
I would say the market model doesn't fit that well with a new energy future. And in fact, the overall energy market model of electricity market design, I don't think is fit for purpose for the next 10 years. The critical issues I see with DSOs are around local flexibility. So if a DSO wants to encourage a heat pump to turn up or down, how does that work if an energy retailer is reacting to wholesale market prices and also wanting to turn that heat pump up and down? So we can get conflicting signals for flexibility, and that makes the job of a DSO quite tough if they're looking at optimizing supply and demand on a local basis. The other angle, which is probably a bigger question, is should DSOs be allowed to own charge points or storage? And at the moment, I think the direction from the European Commission is very much no, but very much yes towards looking at flexibility.
Cool.
Okay. Well, there are more questions we haven't had time to answer, but thanks very much for your attention. We better finish up now. As we said, the recording will be available and we'll send that out afterwards. Please do get in touch with us with any questions you have, any further questions. Thanks for coming today. We hope you enjoyed it. We certainly enjoyed discussing these topics with you all and look forward to being in touch with you or speaking with you or even seeing you at an event maybe sometime soon. Thanks everyone and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Have you ended the broadcast, John?
Not quite sure how to end the broadcast.
Good question.
I'll just shut it, I think.
Yeah, okay. You should automatically do the recording thing now, I think.
Yeah, it does.